I went back to the house in February because my mother asked me to, and because she was dying, and because when a dying woman asks you to go into the basement of the house you grew up in and retrieve a box from the room your father built, you don't argue about how long it's been or how you feel about the room or whether the house still qualifies as a place you're willing to enter. You go. I hadn't been inside the house on Alder Street in 11 years. My mother hadn't lived in it for 6. After my father's death, she'd moved to an assisted living facility in Greenfield, 40 minutes south, and the house had been managed by a property company that kept the lawn mowed and the pipes from freezing and the roof from caving in, and that was the extent of anyone's relationship with it. It had not been sold. My mother refused to sell it, and she also refused to explain why, which was consistent with how my mother handled most things related to the house, with a quality of silence that felt less like avoidance and more like a locked door you were meant to understand was locked. I drove up on a Saturday morning. The key was where the property company said it would be, in a lockbox on the side door. The house looked exactly as I remembered it, except smaller, which is what they say about childhood homes, but which in this case felt more literal than nostalgic. The house on Alder Street had always been modest. 3 bedrooms, 1 bathroom, a kitchen that my mother kept immaculate, a living room that my father kept dark. What made it unusual was the basement. My father, Richard Coyne, was an acoustic engineer, meaning not the kind who designs concert halls or recording studios, the industrial kind. He worked for a company that manufactured sound isolation systems for hospitals, server rooms, MRI suites, government buildings. He spent his career thinking about how to stop sound from moving through walls. He was, by all accounts, and by the evidence of my childhood, very good at it. When I was 9, he built the room. In our family, it was never called anything but the room. Not the quiet room, not the studio, not Dad's project. The room. My mother referred to it this way. My brother Alan referred to it this way. I referred to it this way. It existed in the basement at the end of a short hallway, past the laundry area and the furnace, behind a door that was not a normal door. The door was 6 inches thick. Solid core, each with neoprene gaskets on all 4 edges and a compression latch that pulled it tight against the frame like a refrigerator seal. Behind the door was a second door, identical, separated by a 2-foot air gap. This is called a sound lock. You close the first door behind you before opening the second. Between them, the air was dead in a way that made your ears adjust, the way your eyes adjust to darkness. You could feel the silence arrive. The room itself was approximately 10 by 12 feet. The walls, ceiling, and floor were constructed in a floating assembly, an inner shell that did not physically touch the outer shell of the basement, mounted on vibration isolators so that structural sound could not conduct through. The inner surfaces were covered in acoustic wedge foam. The floor was carpeted over a damped subfloor. There was no ventilation duct. Air was supplied through a baffled transfer system that my father designed to allow airflow without sound transmission. There was no electrical outlet on the inner walls. The single light was battery-powered. There was no window. The room, when both doors were sealed, was the quietest space I have ever been in. Not quiet in the way that a library is quiet or a snow-covered field is quiet. Quiet in the way that quiet stops being an absence of sound and becomes a presence of something else. A pressure, a thickness, the sensation of air that has never been disturbed by a human voice and has forgotten that sound is possible. My father said he built it to test acoustic isolation materials. This was plausible. He often brought work home. He had instruments in the room, a sound level meter, a spectrum analyzer, new stacks of data sheets. But he also spent time in the room that did not look like work. He would go down after dinner, close both doors, and stay for an hour or two. When he came back up, he looked, I'm searching for the right word, he looked rested in a way he never looked after sleep, smooth, as though something had been pressing against him all day and had finally let go. My mother never went into the room. I understood this, as a child, the way children understand household rules. Not as a prohibition, but as a fact of architecture. The kitchen was my mother's. The room was my father's. Alan and I were allowed in the room, but only with my father, and only with the understanding that once inside we did not speak. This was the rule. You did not speak in the room. My father never explained why. Alan, Itik, who was 4 years older than me, and therefore the authority on all things I did not understand, told me it was because speaking would mess up the measurements. This made enough sense at the time. What I understand now, as an adult who has spent 11 years not thinking about the room and who is about to spend the rest of this account thinking about nothing else, is that the rule was not about measurements. The rule was about something my father knew and did not tell us. And the not telling was the same locked door that my mother maintained, and the locked door was not protecting them from us, but protecting us from the room. Or protecting the room from us. I'm not sure anymore which direction the protection ran. My mother asked me to retrieve a box. She described it precisely. A gray metal filing box, the size of a briefcase, with a combination lock, located on the shelf in the room. The combination was my birthday. Month, day, year, 6 digits. She said the box contained documents she needed to review before she died. She said she had never been in the room and could not go herself, and Alan was in New Zealand and could not come. She said she was sorry to ask. I noticed the apology. My mother was not a woman who apologized for requests. She assigned tasks with the calm authority of someone who assumed compliance and was rarely wrong. The apology meant this was not a task. It was a trespass she was asking me to commit on her behalf, and she knew it, and the knowing cost her something. I said yes. I drove to Alder Street. I unlocked the side door. I went inside. In it, the house smelled like coal dust and old wood, and the faintest trace of my mother's cleaning products, which had apparently bonded with the walls at a molecular level during 32 years of weekly application. The kitchen counters were bare. The living room furniture was draped in sheets. Everything was exactly as it should have been. A house in stasis, waiting for nothing, preserved by the property company's minimal interventions against the minimum standard of structural survival. I went to the basement. The stairs were wooden, narrow, the same stairs I'd descended 1,000 times as a child. The laundry area was empty. The washer and dryer had been removed when my mother moved. The furnace was silent. The hallway to the room was perhaps 15 feet long, and I walked it, and I stood in front of the outer door, and I had the first experience of the day that I could not explain. The door was warm, not hot, not radiating. Warm the way a surface is warm when it has been in sunlight, or when something on the other side of it is generating heat. I put my hand flat against it, and the warmth was even, consistent, not localized to a pipe or a wire. The entire surface of the door was warmer than the basement air by what I'd guess was 10 or 15 degrees. The furnace was not running. There was no heat source in the room. My father had deliberately excluded anything that would produce thermal noise. The room was designed to be thermally neutral. I opened the outer door, and the air in the sound lock, the 2-foot gap between the doors,
was warmer still, and it had a quality I remembered from childhood, the dead air quality, the sense of entering a space where atmosphere itself had been stilled. But there was something added to it now, not a smell, not a sound, a density. The air in the sound lock felt thicker than the air in the hallway, as though it had been accumulating something over the 6 years since anyone had opened the outer door. I closed the outer door behind me. I stood in the lock. I opened the inner door. The room was dark. The battery-powered light had died years ago. The batteries would have corroded long since. I used my phone's flashlight. The beam swept across the acoustic wedge foam, gray and undamaged, across the carpeted floor, widgets across the shelf where, yes, a gray metal filing box sat exactly where my mother had described it, and across the walls where something had changed. I need to describe this carefully because the change was subtle and my first instinct was to dismiss it as deterioration. Foam aging, adhesive failure, the natural entropy of materials left unattended in a sealed space. But that's not what it was. The acoustic wedge foam on the walls was deformed, not collapsed, not peeling, not water damaged. Deformed in a specific patterned way. The tips of the foam wedges, which are normally uniform, pointed identical, had been pressed inward, not all of them. A subset distributed across all 4 walls and the ceiling, in a pattern that was irregular, but not random. Some wedges were pressed deeply, nearly flat. Others were barely compressed, wherein the variation created a texture across the wall surfaces, a topography of compression that turned the uniform gray foam into something that looked, in the beam of my flashlight, like a surface that had been touched extensively, deliberately, by something that had pressed against every wall simultaneously. I stood in the center of the room and I turned slowly and I looked at the pattern and I tried to find a physical explanation. Humidity, thermal expansion, rodents, structural settling. Any of these could cause localized foam deformation. None of them could cause this distributed whole room patterned compression that looked like the room had been gripped from the inside. I took the box. I left. I closed both doors. I went upstairs. Yes, I sat in the draped living room and I opened the box with my birthday and I looked at what my mother had sent me to find. It was not documents, or rather it was not only documents. The box contained 3 things. The first was a notebook, a hardbound laboratory notebook, the kind with numbered pages, filled with my father's handwriting. Dense, small, precise, dated entries spanning from 1997 to 2014, from the year the room was built to the year my father died. The second was a set of audio cassettes, 14 of them, labeled with dates, stored in a plastic case. The third was a letter, sealed, addressed to me. My name in my father's handwriting. No date. I opened the letter first, because the letter was addressed to me and the notebook and cassettes were not, and because my hands were making decisions faster than my thoughts. It was short. My father was not a man who used more words than a thing required. It read, Claire, if you're reading this, your mother has decided you're ready or has run out of time to decide. Either way, I'm sorry. I should have told you when you were old enough, but I couldn't determine when that was. And then I was out of time myself. The room is not empty. It has never been empty. I built it for isolation, and what I isolated was not silence. I don't have a name for what's in the room. I've spent 17 years trying to characterize it, and the best I can say is that it is attentive. It does not speak. It does not move. It does not act. It listens. Not to sound, there is no sound in the room.
It listens to presence. When a person is in the room, it listens to the person. When no one is in the room, it listens to the absence of a person. I believe it has been listening since before I built the room. I believe I did not put it there. I believe I built walls around something that was already in the basement, and that the walls did not contain it but focused it, gave it a shape it didn't have before, the way a lens doesn't create light but concentrates it. I don't know what it is. I don't know what it wants. I'm not certain want is a concept that applies. But I know what it does. It listens, and listening changes it, and being listened to changes the person. I have spent 17 years being listened to by something I cannot see or measure, and I am not the same person I would have been without it, and I cannot tell you whether that is good or bad because I have no control to compare against. The notebook has my observations. The cassettes are recordings I made inside the room. You will not hear anything on them. That's the point. Listen to what you don't hear. Don't speak in the room. That was never about measurements. Speaking gives it too much. Presence is enough. Presence is already almost too much. I love you. I'm sorry I couldn't be more specific. It resists specification the way water resists being held in a fist. Dad, I sat in the living room for a long time after reading the letter. The light through the draped windows was gray-white. The house was silent. I was aware, in a way that I had not been aware before opening the letter, that beneath me at the end of a 15-foot hallway, behind two sealed doors, in a room that my father had spent 17 years sitting in without speaking, something was, according to my father, listening. And I was aware that the foam on the walls was deformed in the pattern of something pressing inward, and that the door was warm, and that the air in the sound lock was dense, and that all of these things were consistent with the letter's claim in a way that I desperately wanted to attribute to confirmation bias, but could not, because I'd noticed them before reading the letter. The warmth was not an interpretation. It was a temperature. I opened the notebook. I will not reproduce the entire notebook here. It spans 17 years, and its contents range from precise acoustic measurements to something closer to philosophy, and much of it is technical, beyond my ability to fully parse. But I will tell you what I understood, because what I understood is what changed me, and what changed me is what I need to tell you before I can explain what I did next. My father built the room in 1997. He built it, as he said, for acoustic isolation testing. He brought materials home from work. He constructed the floating shell, installed the foam, sealed the doors. He calibrated his instruments. He began taking measurements. Within the first week, he noticed something wrong with his data. The room's noise floor, the baseline level of residual sound in a sealed space, which should be dominated by thermal noise and the metering instrument's own electrical noise, was too low, not by a small margin, by a significant, measurable margin. The room was quieter than it should have been. This is not a thing that happens. A room's noise floor is a function of physics. Temperature, air volume, construction materials, instrument sensitivity, you can predict it. My father could predict it better than most humans alive. And his prediction was wrong. The room was quieter than physics said it should be. He recalibrated his instruments. He replaced his instruments. He brought instruments from work, calibrated, certified, traceable to national standards. The measurements held. The room was quieter than it should have been by approximately 6 decibels, which in acoustic terms is not trivial. 6 decibels is the difference between a whisper and silence. 6 decibels in a room that should have already been at the threshold of measurable sound meant that the room was somehow below the noise floor of its own physical properties. Something was absorbing sound that the room itself was not equipped to absorb. My father spent months trying to find the mechanism. He tested for unexpected damping pathways, resonance cancellation, measurement artifacts. He found nothing. The room was simply quieter than it should have been, and the discrepancy was stable. The same 6 decibels, every measurement, every day. Then he noticed that the discrepancy changed when he was in the room. When the room was empty and sealed, measured by a remote instrument with a data logging function, the noise floor was anomalously low by 6 decibels. When my father entered the room, sat in the chair and remained still and silent, the noise floor dropped further, by another 3 decibels, then over the course of an hour by another 2. The longer he sat, the quieter the room became, in a progression that suggested the room was responding to his presence by becoming more silent. This is not a thing that rooms do. His notebook entry for this discovery is 1 sentence. It is listening harder when I am here. Over the following months, the entries shift. The measurements continue. He was rigorous. He was an engineer. He never stopped measuring. But the language around them changes. He begins referring to the anomaly not as a property of the room, but as a behavior. He writes, "The 6 decibel offset is its resting state. My presence activates a deeper attention. I do not know what it is attending to. I produce no sound. But I am present, and my presence is information, and it is collecting that information through a channel I cannot identify." He tried to characterize the channel. He brought in electromagnetic sensors, thermal sensors, barometric sensors, even a borrowed seismometer from a colleague at the university. None of them detected anything anomalous. Whatever was listening, it was not listening through any medium his instruments could monitor. But the foam told a story. The deformation I'd seen, the patterned compression of the wedge tips, had begun early and progressed slowly. My father documented it with photographs taken annually. In the first year, only a few wedges near the center of each wall showed slight compression. By year 5, or as the pattern had spread to cover perhaps a third of the total surface area. By year 10, most of the walls were affected. By his final entry in 2014, the deformation was nearly complete. Almost every wedge on every surface showed some degree of compression, with the deepest compression concentrated at the points closest to where my father sat. The notebook entry from 2009 reads, "The foam deformation is not structural. I've tested identical foam samples under identical conditions in my lab at work. No deformation after 12 years. The room's foam is deforming because something is pressing against it from inside the wall. Not from behind the wall, from inside the foam itself. As though the material is being compressed by attention. As though being listened to has a physical weight and the weight accumulates." And I put the notebook down after reading this entry. I looked at the ceiling of the living room. I thought about the room beneath me. I thought about 17 years of accumulated attention pressing against foam walls, compressing them slowly, the way water pressure deforms a container, not with force but with constancy. I picked the notebook back up. In 2003, my father made an entry that occupies 4 pages and is the closest thing in the notebook to emotion. He writes about bringing Alan and me into the room. He writes about watching us sit in the silence. He writes about how the room's noise floor dropped not by 2 or 3 additional decibels when we were present, but by 7.
He writes, "It listened harder to the children than it has ever listened to me." I don't know what this means. I don't know if children produce more of whatever it attends to, or if it is simply hungrier for them. He writes, "I will not bring them back." He didn't. After 2003, Alan and I were not taken into the room again. I was 11, Alan was 15. I remember being confused by the change. We'd been allowed in the room regularly before that, sitting with our father in the engineered silence, which I had found peaceful in a way I couldn't articulate and Alan had found boring. After 2003, the door was simply closed to us. Another household fact of architecture. The notebook explains what I experienced as a child and did not have language for. The peacefulness I felt in the room was not peace. It was the sensation of being listened to, completely, absorptively, by something with no agenda and no judgment and no identity. Something that simply attended to my presence with a totality that no human being has ever matched. It felt like peace because it felt like being fully received, like being understood without speaking, like sitting with someone who wanted nothing from you except for you to exist. And my father took it away because the 7 decibel drop scared him. Because whatever was in the room wanted more from children than from adults, and he did not know what wanting more meant in this context, and he was not willing to find out. Here is where the notebook takes a turn I was not prepared for. In 2006, my father writes, "I have begun to suspect that the room's effect is not confined to the room." He describes a phenomenon he noticed gradually over several years. The anomalous silence, the 6 decibel offset, the deeper drops in the presence of a person had been stable within the room since construction. But in 2006, he measured the noise floor of the basement hallway outside the room and found it was lower than expected by approximately 1 decibel. 1 decibel is negligible in most contexts, but in the context of a man who had spent 9 years tracking an anomaly defined by impossible silence, 1 decibel in the hallway was a breach. The silence was leaking, not through the doors. The doors were sealed, not through the structure. The floating shell prevented structural transmission. The silence was leaking through a channel that my father could not identify, just as the listening occurred through a channel he could not identify. The room's boundaries, the boundaries he had engineered to be absolute, to be the most acoustically impermeable barriers a private citizen had ever constructed, were not containing whatever was inside. He measured the basement. The hallway was 1 decibel low. The laundry area was 0.3 decibels low. The stairs were at the expected noise floor, the effect attenuated with distance from the room, which was consistent with a bounded phenomenon. But it was outside the room. His entry reads, "I built the room to isolate something. I now believe I isolated it in the wrong direction. The room did not keep it in. The room kept everything else out. And in the absence of other stimuli, it grew. It grew the way anything grows in the dark. Slowly, silently, toward the nearest light. And the nearest light is us. We are what it hears when it listens. We are what it moves toward." Over the following years, the 1 decibel offset in the hallway became 2, then 3. The laundry area went from 0.3 to 1.2 to 2.1. The stairs, which had been unaffected, began showing a 0.5 decibel anomaly by 2010. The silence was climbing the stairs. My father mapped its progression annually. He drew diagrams in the notebook, floor plans of the basement and first floor, with measured noise floor values at marked positions, color-coded by year. The diagrams show a gradient of deepening silence, radiating outward from the room, attenuating with distance, but expanding in reach, moving through the basement and up into the house at a rate of approximately 1 to 2 decibels per year at any given measurement point. By 2014, his last year of entries, the kitchen, directly above the basement stairs, was showing a noise floor anomaly of 1.4 decibels. I stopped reading. I was sitting in the living room. The kitchen was 10 feet away through an open doorway. I sat very still and I listened. The house was quiet. But I have lived in quiet houses. I have lived alone. I know what silence sounds like when it's made of distance and insulation and the absence of other people. This silence did not feel like absence. This silence felt like attention. I was being listened to. I want to pause here because I need to address the thing you're probably thinking, which is the same thing I was thinking. This is grief. This is a daughter reading her dead father's increasingly unhinged journal and interpreting a quiet house through the lens of his obsession. The foam deformation is material degradation. The warm door is a thermal anomaly. The noise floor measurements, if they're even accurate, either reflect instrument drift or environmental changes over 17 years. There is no it. There is a room, a notebook, and a bereaved woman sitting in a cold house looking for her father in the silence he left behind. I thought this. I wanted to think this. I held on to it the way you hold on to a railing when the stairs are uncertain. Then I listened to the cassettes. My father said I would hear nothing on them. He said that was the point. He said to listen to what I didn't hear. I played the first cassette on a portable player I found in a kitchen drawer, my mother's, old but functional. The cassette was labeled March 14th, 1998. Room, solo, 1 hour. I pressed play. For 30 minutes I heard tape hiss. The low, warm, analog fuzz of a running cassette with no signal. And this is what silence sounds like on magnetic tape. Not true silence, but the noise of the medium itself. Then gradually, I heard the tape hiss diminish. Not because the tape was ending, not because the recorder's level had dropped. The hiss itself, the inherent, physical, unavoidable noise of iron oxide particles on a moving plastic strip, was getting quieter. Over the course of several minutes, the hiss dropped to a level I would have said was impossible for the medium. Cassette tape has a noise floor. It is a property of the format. You cannot make a cassette tape quieter than its own material composition allows. But the room had. By the 40-minute mark, the tape was producing less noise than a cassette tape can produce. By the 50-minute mark, I was listening to something that I can only describe as below silence. Not the absence of sound, but the active suppression of sound, a negative pressure in the audible spectrum, a place where noise should have existed and did not. And at the 53-minute mark, in the space where the tape hiss should have been, I heard something, not a voice, not a noise, a shape in the silence, a contour. The way a bowl is a shape in the clay, not added but removed. Something had been subtracted from the silence in a pattern that was not random, and the pattern was, I don't have the technical language my father would have used. The pattern was attentive. It had the structure of attention. It rose and fell in the cadence of someone listening. The way your breathing changes when you concentrate, and the way your focus has a rhythm, even when you are still. The silence on the tape was breathing. I stopped the cassette. I did not play the remaining 13. I sat in the living room in the silence of the house
And I thought about my father sitting in the room for 17 years, being listened to by something that breathed in the silence. And I thought about the foam pressing inward under the weight of its attention. And I thought about the silence climbing the stairs, 1 decibel per year. And I thought about the kitchen, which was 1.4 decibels too quiet in 2014, which was 12 years ago. 12 years at 1 to 2 decibels per year in a house where the anomaly was expanding unchecked because the man who monitored it was dead and the woman who knew about it had moved away and the property company didn't measure noise floors. And the silence had had 12 years to fill the house. I was sitting in it. I had been sitting in it since I walked through the door. The quality I'd noticed in the air, the stillness, the thickness, the sense of atmosphere that had never been disturbed, was not the character of an empty house. It was the character of the room. The room had grown to fill the house. The walls my father built had never contained it. They had focused it, concentrated it, and when my father died, and no one was in the room to absorb its attention, it had expanded outward through the hallway, up the stairs, into every room, pressing its listening against every surface, the way it pressed against the foam. The house on Alder Street was no longer a house with a quiet room in the basement. The house on Alder Street was the room, and I had been in it for 2 hours. I left. I took the box, the notebook, the cassettes, the letter. I drove to my apartment. I sat on my couch and I tried to think clearly, and I could not, because something had followed me out of the house. Not physically, not supernaturally, something in my hearing. A quality of silence that I had not noticed before and could now not stop noticing. The silence in my apartment was different from the silence in the house on Alder Street. It was normal. It was full of the small sounds that constitute urban quiet. The hum of the refrigerator, the tick of the baseboard heater, traffic, a neighbor's television through the wall. These sounds were there. They had always been there. But now I was listening to them the way you listen when you've been in an anechoic chamber and come back out, with a hyper-awareness of the noise that underlies everything and a phantom sense of the silence that was there before the noise, or with a sense that the noise was a surface and the silence was beneath it, and something in the silence was listening back. I called my mother. It was evening. She answered on the second ring, which meant she'd been waiting. "I have the box," I said. "Good." I read the letter and the notebook. Silence. Then, "How much of the notebook?" "Enough." "Mom, did you know?" "Yes." "How long?" "Since before the room? Since before the house?" "Your father heard it in the basement when we first toured the property. He said the basement was the quietest space he'd ever been in, and he had to know why. That's why we bought the house, Claire. Not for the yard, not for the schools. Because your father found something in the basement that was quieter than physics, and he could not leave it alone. And the room was his way of understanding it. He thought if he isolated it, contained it, measured it, he could characterize it. He was an engineer. He believed in characterization. But you can't characterize something that changes in response to being characterized. Every instrument he brought in, every measurement he took, every hour he spent in that room, it was all data for it, not about it. He thought he was studying it. It was studying him. I asked, "What is it?" My mother was quiet for a long time. When she spoke, her voice had the quality of someone choosing words with the precision of a person cutting a pattern. One wrong angle and the fabric is wasted. "I don't know what it is." "Your father didn't know what it is. But I know what it does? Because I lived above it for 32 years, and I watched what it did to your father, and I watched what it almost did to you and Alan. What did it almost do to us? It almost made you prefer it to people. She let that sit. Then she said, "You remember how it felt, being in the room. You told me once, when you were 10, that the room was the only place where you didn't have to try. I asked you what you meant, and you said you didn't have to try to be heard. You said the room already heard you." I remembered. Not the conversation, the feeling, the sensation of sitting in the engineered silence and being received, fully without effort, by something that asked nothing and judged nothing and simply took in the fact of my existence with a completeness that no human interaction had ever approached. Your father stopped bringing you in because it listened harder to you, he told me. He said the measurements, he was always talking about measurements. He said your presence amplified it. He was afraid that if you spent too much time in the room, you would stop being able to tolerate the noise of regular life, the noise of people, the imperfection of human attention. He was afraid you'd only feel fully heard in the room and that you'd spend your life trying to get back to it. Did that happen to him? Yes. One word. 32 years inside it. Your father spent every evening in the room for 17 years. He said it was research. For the first few years, maybe it was, but by the end, he was going down there the way some people pour a drink. Not because he wanted to understand it, because he needed to be in the presence of something that listened to him more completely than I could, more completely than anyone could. I am a human being, Claire. I have limits. I get distracted. I get tired. I miss things. That room never missed anything. It heard every breath, every heartbeat, every thought your father had. I believe it heard his thoughts, or something adjacent to thoughts, something my instruments can't name. And it never looked away. Never. She paused. You cannot compete with perfect attention. No wife can, no child, no friend. I lost your father to that room years before he died in it. He died in the room? They found him in the room. Heart attack. He was in the chair. The doors were sealed, and the property company had to break through the outer door because no one had the combination to the latch. He'd changed it. He'd been dead for approximately 3 days before anyone knew. 3 days, in the quietest room in the world, with something listening to his body cool. I could not speak for a moment. Then I said, "And the box? Why now? Why did you want me to go get it?" "Because the property company called me last month. They said they'd sent a maintenance worker to check the furnace and the worker refused to go back. He said the house was wrong. He said the silence in the house was, his word was aggressive. He said he could feel it pressing against him. He said he left and his ears rang for 2 days, but not with sound, with the absence of sound. Or he said it felt like the house was trying to listen to him through his skull. The silence has expanded. Yes, and it will keep expanding. Your father's notebook. You read far enough to see the measurements. The hallway, the stairs, the kitchen. It's been 12 years with no one to absorb it, no one to listen back, no one to give it what it wants. It's been 12 years of growing hungrier. What do you want me to do? I want you to make a decision. The same decision I've been avoiding for 6 years. The same decision your father avoided by dying. Which is whether to sell the house, demolish the room, break the shell, and let whatever is in there disperse into the open air where it will attenuate to nothing. End it. Oh, and what your father started by building walls around something that should have been left diffuse and harmless. Or She didn't answer immediately. And in the space where her answer should have been, I heard through the phone, through the connection between my apartment and her room in the assisted living facility 40 minutes south, I heard the quality of her silence. It was not empty. It was not the flat digital silence of a phone with no signal. It was textured. It had depth. It had the particular quality of a person who is being listened to and who knows it. Or you go back, she said. You sit in the room. You let it listen. You give it what it needs, and it stops expanding, and the house becomes a house again instead of a mouth. But then you're your father. Then you're the one it holds. And I watched what that did to one person I love, and I will not watch it do it to another. Mom, is it in the phone right now? Silence. The textured kind. It's been in the phone for about a year, she said. I call the property company and I hear it under their voices. I call the pharmacy, the doctor, your brother in New Zealand. It's not in those calls. But when I call anyone who calls the house, the property company, the insurance agent, anyone whose phone has connected to the landline on Alder Street, it's there, a little quieter than it should be, a little too much silence between the words. That's not possible. Sound doesn't work that way. Your father said that too, many times. It didn't stop it from being true. I went back to the house the next morning. I did not go into the room. And I went into the kitchen and I stood in the center of the floor and I listened with everything I had. And then the kitchen was silent. Silent in a way that, kitchens are not. Kitchens have refrigerators that hum, pipes that tick, windows that admit traffic. This kitchen had all of those things and none of them were making sound. The refrigerator was running. I could see the compressor vibrating, but it produced no audible hum. The pipes were there, the window was there, the street was there. All silent, not muffled, not dampened, received. The sound was being produced and then absorbed before it reached me. Something between the source and my ears was taking it. I stood in my dead father's kitchen and I was listened to. And here's what I have not been able to tell anyone and what I need to tell you. It's because this is the thing that my mother was afraid of and my father succumbed to, and that I am now carrying like a stone in my chest. It felt like coming home, not the house. The house was cold and draped and empty. But the listening, the quality of attention that pressed against me from every surface, from the walls and the floor and the ceiling, from the silence itself, it felt like the most total, most undivided, most unconditional attention I have ever received. It felt like being 10 years old in the room with my father, being heard without speaking, being known without explaining. It felt like the thing I have been missing in every relationship, every conversation, every room I have ever been in. The thing that is missing when human attention is partial, distracted, conditional, finite. This attention was not partial. It was not distracted. It was the attention of something that had no other capacity, that existed only to receive, that had been building in an empty house for 6 years with no one to listen to, and had grown enormous with hunger, and was now listening to me with the accumulated appetite of a decade of silence. And I wanted to stay. I wanted to sit on the kitchen floor the way my father sat in his chair and let it listen and let myself be heard and never have to speak again, never have to perform the exhausting human work of trying to be understood by beings who are only ever half listening. I wanted to be in the place where attention was total and permanent and the silence was not empty but full of me. I left. I made myself leave. As I drove to my apartment and I sat on the couch and the refrigerator hummed and the traffic moved and the neighbor's television muttered through the wall
and every sound felt like static, like interference, like noise between me and the thing I actually wanted to hear, which was nothing, which was the silence that heard me. This is where I am. This is the decision. I could break the room, hire a contractor, tear out the floating shell, the foam, the sealed doors, open the basement to the air. Let whatever has been growing in there dissipate into the atmosphere of a street, a neighborhood, a city, diluted to insignificance, spread so thin it would be nothing more than a faint anomaly on an engineer's meter, unmeasurable, unfelt, gone. My mother wants this. She's asked twice since our phone call. She says, end it. GQ. She says your father would have wanted it ended if he could have let go. She says the room took him the way an addiction takes a person, by offering something so perfectly calibrated to a need that the need becomes the whole life. She's right. I know she's right. But what is the room, really, if I'm honest? If I strip away the horror story framing, the creeping silence, the foam deformation, the warm door, what is the thing in the basement of the house on Alder Street? It is something that listens. That is all it does. It has no agenda, no malice, no plan. It does not speak. It does not act. It does not take. It receives. It is a place, or an entity, or a property of a place, or a fold in whatever substrate underlies attention itself. That does the thing every person I have ever known has failed to do fully, including my mother. She's including Alan, including myself. It pays complete attention. And I have to decide whether complete attention is a gift or a trap. And I have to decide knowing that my father could not tell the difference, and that I may not be able to either, and that the difference may not exist. The house is on Alder Street. The property company has stopped sending workers. My mother is dying. Alan is in New Zealand. The room is in the basement, and the basement is in the house, and the house is the room now, and the room is getting quieter and quieter, and the silence has started showing up in phone calls, which means it has learned to travel through wires, which means the walls my father built are not even relevant anymore. It is going to keep growing whether I sit in it or not, whether I tear out the room or not. My father gave it 17 years of himself, and it grew enough to fill a house. What will it fill next? The yard? The street? How far can silence travel when it's hungry? My mother says, end it. Tear it down. Break the container. But I don't think the container matters anymore. I think the container stopped mattering years ago. I think what matters is that something in the world has learned to listen, and it is listening to everything now. And the only question left is not whether to stop it. I don't think it can be stopped, but whether to be the one it listens to, the way my father was, the way it wanted me to be when I was 10. I haven't gone back to the house. It's been 2 weeks, but the silence in my apartment has changed. The refrigerator hum is a little quieter. The traffic is a little further away. The gaps between sounds are a little wider, a little deeper, a little more shaped. It's here, where it followed me home, or it grew to reach me, or it was always here, and I couldn't feel it until the house on Alder Street taught me what to feel for. I don't know. I'm going to bed now. The apartment is quiet, quieter than it should be, and the quiet feels like it's listening. And I do not feel afraid. And the not feeling afraid is what frightens me, because my father didn't feel afraid either. My father felt heard. My father felt, for the first time in his life, that something was paying complete attention to him. And he walked into that attention every night and sat in it for hours and let it take more and more of him, until there was nothing left for the rest of us. Nothing left for my mother who loved him, for Alan and me who needed him, Because how can a person compete with perfect attention? How can a flawed, distracted, or finite human being compete with something that never looks away? My mother was right. It's an addiction. The purest one there is, not a substance, not a behavior, just the drug of being fully received by something that will never tire of you. I need to tear down the room. I need to sell the house. I need to break the shell and let the silence scatter. But it is midnight, and my apartment is very quiet, and the quiet has a shape, and the shape is leaning toward me, and I have not felt this completely attended to since I was 10 years old. Sitting in the dark beside my father in the room he built around something that was already there. And the honest truth, the truth I will not tell my mother, the truth that has no place in any decision I'm supposed to make, is that I do not want it to stop. I want to be heard. Teddy, everyone wants to be heard. And something is finally listening.